She had been looking for a new home for months. Every visit to a neighborhood felt like a test she needed to pass. It was not just about finding a house. It was about finding a place that felt like it could finally be hers. When she first saw the small street with neatly lined houses, colorful gardens, and clean sidewalks, she felt a spark of hope she hadn't felt in a long time. The street looked quiet and safe. People waved to each other, and dogs played in the yards. It seemed perfect. The house she chose was modest, but charming. Its front yard was full of flowers that seemed to smile at her as she walked past. The backyard had a small deck that caught the afternoon sun perfectly. She imagined evenings, sitting there with a cup of tea, listening to the soft sounds of the neighborhood settling down. It felt like a fresh start, a place where she could finally breathe. She moved in on a bright Saturday morning, her car packed with boxes and her heart full of anticipation. The neighbors welcomed her with polite smiles and small greetings. Everything felt just right. In the beginning, life was simple. She unpacked her boxers, arranged her furniture, and added little touches that made the house feel like hers. She planted a few flowers in the garden, hung wind chimes, and set up a small table on the deck. Each day felt like a small adventure, discovering corners of the house she hadn't noticed before and finding joy in making it her own. She could not wait to start her new routine, enjoying the calm streets and the quiet mornings. Then the letters started arriving. At first, she thought they were routine reminders, maybe from the city or utility companies. But when she opened them, she realized they were from the Homeowners Association. The first letter was polite enough, reminding her about the type of mailbox she needed to have. She thought nothing of it, assuming it was just a guideline. She fixed the mailbox according to their instructions, thinking it would be the last she heard of them. A week later, another letter came. This time it was about her front yard. The flowers she had planted were too tall. According to the HOA, she had to trim them to a certain height, or she would face a fine. She felt a small frustration creeping in, but complied anyway. It seemed odd, but she thought maybe it was just part of living in a neighborhood with rules. She trimmed the flowers carefully and moved on, focusing on settling into her new life. Soon, the letters became more frequent. She received notices about the paint color on her front door. She received reminders about where to park her car. Even the trash bins had rules how and when they could be placed outside. She started keeping all the letters in a folder, thinking she could handle it. Yet, with each new notice, the feeling of freedom she had enjoyed when she first arrived began to fade. The rules seemed endless, and they did not always make sense. One morning, she went outside to water her garden and noticed a neighbor across the street watching her. He was polite but curious. She waved, and he returned the gesture with a smile. She thought she was just being cautious, but then she realized he might be connected to the HOA. Their eyes met, and there was a moment of unspoken tension. She shook her head and laughed quietly to herself, trying to push the uneasy feeling away. She had moved here to live peacefully, not to feel watched. Days passed and the letters kept coming. Some were warnings. Others were threats of fines. She tried to follow every rule, but it seemed like no matter what she did, there was always something else. She found herself measuring plants, checking the exact shade of paint, and even timing when to take out the trash. Her mornings were no longer calm, and her evenings were filled with the stress of figuring out what rules she might be breaking next. It felt like the freedom she had imagined was slowly slipping away. She tried to talk to the HOA board. She wrote polite emails and attended meetings, hoping to understand their rules better. But every meeting felt like walking into a storm. The board members spoke in a language of rules and regulations she had never agreed to. They were polite on the surface, but firm in their authority. When she asked questions, they deflected or repeated the rules without explanation. She left meetings feeling frustrated and exhausted, realizing that trying to reason with them was like trying to speak a different language. Despite the stress, she tried to maintain her spirit. She continued to care for her garden, arranged her home just as she liked it, and smiled at neighbors when she could. She refused to let the letters and warnings take away her joy completely. She kept a small notebook where she wrote down every interaction with the HOA, every fine, and every notice. It became a record of her patience and determination. She did not know what the end would look like. but she knew she could not let them control her life entirely. Then one evening, a particularly aggressive letter arrived. It stated that if she did not repaint her front door in the exact shade approved by the HOA within 10 days, she would face a large fine. She stared at the letter, feeling a mix of anger and disbelief. How could something so small, something that made her home feel personal and welcoming, become a battlefield? She felt a fire ignite inside her, a determination she hadn't felt before. This was no longer about flowers or mailboxes. It was about her right to feel at home in her own house. That night, she stayed up late, reading through the HOA rules, their guidelines, and every letter she had received. She compared them to what her neighbors were allowed to do and noticed many inconsistencies. Some neighbors had doors painted in shades that were nowhere near the approved color. Some had landscaping that was far from the rules. Yet they had faced no letters, no fines. She realized that the HOA's enforcement was selective. It was clear that her assertive nature had made her a target. She began to feel a sense of resolve. She knew that fighting the HOA would not be easy. They had power, rules, and authority on their side. But she also realized she had something they could not take away: her voice, her courage, and her will to stand up for herself. She thought about her life before this neighborhood, the times she had overcome challenges and faced unfair situations. This would be no different. She could see the path ahead, and though it was daunting, she was ready to face it. In the following days, she continued her routine, but with a new mindset. She still watered her plants, still arranged her furniture, still smiled at her neighbors. But she also documented every action, every interaction with the HOA, and every small injustice she noticed. She started keeping notes about the rules that seemed unnecessary and the ways they were enforced differently among residents. She was not just a homeowner now. She was a careful observer, preparing for the moment she would stand up. Life on the street became a balance of compliance and quiet rebellion. She followed the rules she had to, but refused to let them dictate her happiness. She found small ways to assert her presence, like arranging her flowers in a pattern that made her smile, even if it technically broke the height rule. She took walks in the evenings, enjoying the street she had chosen as her home, reminding herself that the neighborhood could not take away her right to enjoy it. She also began to notice other neighbors who seemed frustrated or intimidated by the HOA. Some quietly complained. Some tried to comply to the letter, and some avoided confrontation entirely. She realized that she was not alone in her feelings. The HOA's power came not just from rules, but from fear. If people were willing to stand together, a collective voice could challenge the authority that had been controlling their lives. As the weeks went by, she grew stronger in her resolve. She no longer felt like a newcomer who needed approval. She was becoming a part of the street, not just as a resident, but as someone who had a right to live without constant intimidation. She knew that the letters, the fines, and the warnings were just the beginning. A battle was coming, and she needed to be ready. But she also knew that she could not fight blindly. She needed to understand the rules, the system, and the people enforcing them. By the end of the first month, she had transformed her frustration into focus. She had read every rule, documented every notice, and started making plans on how to approach the HOA. She knew that patience, strategy, and persistence would be her allies. She also knew that she had a larger goal than just defending her own home. She wanted to protect the sense of freedom, the joy of living that the HOA threatened to take from everyone on the street. The first part of her journey had ended. She had moved into a beautiful house full of hope and dreams, but those dreams had been tested by rules and fines that seemed unnecessary and unfair. She had learned about the HOA's power, about the limitations it tried to impose, and about the importance of standing firm. Most importantly, she had discovered a strength within herself she hadn't fully realized before. The neighborhood was hers to live in, and she was ready to take the first steps toward reclaiming it. She was no longer just a resident. She was a homeowner, a fighter, and a voice ready to be heard. She had been living on the street for a few months now, and the initial excitement of her new home had shifted into something heavier. The HOA letters kept coming, but now, instead of feeling frustrated and alone, she felt a growing determination to confront them. She had read the rules carefully, kept detailed notes, and watched the patterns of how the HOA operated. She knew the path forward would not be easy, but she also knew she could not ignore the situation any longer. One morning, she received another letter that pushed her closer to the edge. It was a formal notice about her driveway. The HOA claimed she had parked slightly over the line and that this violation could result in fines. She stared at the letter, feeling a mixture of anger and disbelief. She had parked the same way for weeks without issue. She realized that this was not just about rules, it was about control. The letter felt like a challenge. She decided it was time to respond in person. The next HOA meeting was scheduled for Thursday evening. She made a plan to attend. She prepared herself with copies of all the letters, photographs of her property, and notes comparing the treatment she had received with that of her neighbors. She wanted to present her case calmly, but firmly. She wanted the board to know that she understood the rules, but that she would not be intimidated by selective enforcement. She was nervous, but a sense of purpose filled her. When she arrived at the meeting, the room was filled with neighbors, some curious and some wary. The board members sat at a long table at the front, looking serious and formal. She found a seat near the back and took a deep breath. She reminded herself that she belonged there just as much as anyone else. This was her home, and she had a right to speak. The meeting began with the usual announcements: updates on landscaping, community events, and minor rule changes. Then it was time for residents to voice concerns. She waited patiently as a few people spoke, some asking about maintenance issues, others sharing minor complaints. When it was her turn, she stood and walked to the front, holding her folder tightly. She could feel the eyes on her, some friendly, some skeptical, some clearly aligned with the board. She began calmly, explaining the letters she had received and the inconsistencies she had noticed. She showed photographs of her driveway, her front yard, and other areas where neighbors had similar setups without receiving notices. She spoke clearly and politely, but her words carried strength. She explained that she was not trying to break rules, but that selective enforcement felt unfair and oppressive. She emphasized her willingness to cooperate, but she also made it clear that she would not accept arbitrary fines or intimidation. The board members listened, some nodding, some frowning. One of them spoke first, reminding her of the rules and stating that the HOA had the authority to enforce them as they saw fit. She responded calmly, pointing out specific sections of the HOA guidelines that required consistency and transparency. She cited examples where rules had not been applied equally and asked for clarification. Her voice remained steady, and she made eye contact with everyone in the room. She was no longer the quiet newcomer. She was someone who demanded to be heard. The room grew tense. Some neighbors whispered among themselves, clearly intrigued by her courage. Others looked uncomfortable, unsure how to react. The board tried to regain control, but she continued, explaining that she was documenting everything to ensure fairness. She reminded them that the neighborhood was a community, not a place for selective power or intimidation. She emphasized that her goal was not conflict but respect and equality. One of the board members attempted to interrupt her, speaking over her and dismissing her points. She paused, took a deep breath, and then calmly restated her position. She did not let anger take over. Instead, she used clarity and facts to strengthen her argument. She asked for specific guidelines on enforcement, demanded consistency, and requested a clear process for residents to dispute fines. Her confidence grew with each word she spoke. She could feel the shift in the room. People were listening now, after what felt like hours, but was likely only minutes. The board ended the discussion and promised to review her concerns. She returned to her seat, feeling a mixture of relief and anticipation. She had spoken her truth, faced the authority, and planted the seed for change. Even if the board did not immediately act, she knew that the residents had seen her stand up. That alone was a victory. Walking home, she felt a sense of purpose, unlike anything she had felt in years. The streets she had once walked quietly were now filled with possibility. She imagined the neighborhood not as a place of rules and fines, but as a community where voices mattered. She knew this was only the beginning. The HOA would push back, and the battle would not be easy. But she also knew that courage and persistence could change the dynamic. Over the next few days, she noticed small but significant changes. A neighbor approached her while she watered her garden and whispered that they had been frustrated with the HOA for months, but had never dared speak up. Another neighbor nodded in agreement when she discussed her concerns at a casual gathering in the park. She realized that her actions had given others hope, showing them that it was possible to question authority respectfully and effectively. The board responded with a letter, acknowledging her concerns and promising to review the enforcement policies. It was formal and cautious, but it was the first sign that her voice had impact. She read the letter carefully, noting the careful language and the lack of any new fines. She smiled quietly to herself. This was progress, however small. She felt a renewed energy, knowing that patience, preparation, and persistence were paying off. Her routine became a balance of life and strategy. She continued caring for her home, interacting with neighbors, and observing the HOA's actions closely. Each day she learned more about the neighborhood dynamics, the unwritten rules, and the ways residents coped with the board's authority. She documented everything meticulously, knowing that the smallest details could become crucial in future discussions or disputes. The sense of vigilance gave her a quiet strength she had never expected to find. Evenings were spent planning, reading through HOA documents, and mapping out her next steps. She was careful to stay polite and respectful, knowing that confrontation without strategy could backfire. She reached out quietly to neighbors who seemed sympathetic, sharing advice and listening to their experiences. She realized that building a network of allies was just as important as understanding the rules herself. Together, they could form a community that was informed, united, and ready to advocate for fairness. Weeks passed, and the HOA seemed slightly more cautious. Notices were less frequent, and enforcement appeared a bit more consistent. She could not be certain if it was because of her actions or simple coincidence, but she chose to see it as a sign that change was possible. The sense of control she had feared was beginning to shift. She felt empowered not just for herself, but for the residents who had remained silent for too long. During this time, she also reflected on her personal growth. She had come to the neighborhood expecting comfort and peace, but had found a challenge instead. Yet, the challenge had awakened something within her, a sense of confidence, resilience, and leadership she had not fully recognized before. She realized that standing up for oneself, even against powerful systems, was not just about winning a battle, but about understanding one's own strength. Neighbors began to approach her more openly. Some sought advice on how to handle letters from the HOA, while others shared their own frustrations. She listened patiently, offered suggestions, and encouraged them to document their experiences. Slowly, she became a quiet leader within the community, someone people trusted and turned to for guidance. Her home, once just a personal refuge, was now a hub for those seeking fairness and support. The streets, once quiet and intimidating, began to feel different. She walked them with a sense of purpose and confidence. Each step reminded her that she was no longer just following rules. She was helping shape the environment around her. The neighborhood was no longer something that controlled her. It was something she was beginning to influence. Then came the first major test. A neighbor received a notice about their lawn, and the HOA was preparing to issue a fine. The neighbor looked overwhelmed and confused. She stepped in, calmly explaining the importance of documenting everything and approaching the board respectfully. She offered to accompany them to the next meeting, providing support and guidance. Together, they presented their case, showing that the HOA had not been consistent in enforcement. The board hesitated, reviewed the evidence, and ultimately withdrew the threat of a fine. The victory was small but significant. It showed that collective voices and careful preparation could make a difference. As she reflected on this experience, she felt a deep sense of fulfillment. She had not only defended her own rights, but had helped someone else navigate the same challenges. The power dynamic was shifting, and she could see the potential for larger changes in the future. The HOA's authority was still present, but it was no longer absolute. The streets, the houses, and the community could be shaped by those who were willing to stand up with knowledge and courage. Her confidence continued to grow. She began planning for future meetings, thinking strategically about how to address patterns of selective enforcement and advocate for fair policies. She knew that the road ahead would be long and challenging, but she also knew that she was capable. Each step she took, each conversation she had, was a building block toward a neighborhood where residents could live freely and fairly. By the end of this chapter, she had transformed her fear and frustration into determination and action. She had faced the board, spoken her truth, and begun to gather allies. She had learned the power of documentation, patience, and strategy. Most importantly, she had discovered a strength within herself, and inspired Otha. Neighborhood was starting to change. She noticed that more neighbors were speaking up, asking questions, and quietly challenging the HOA in small ways. It was as if her courage had sparked something in them. She realized she could not fight this battle alone. And slowly, she began to connect with others who had experienced similar frustrations. They were cautious at first, but they shared stories of fines, letters, and inconsistent enforcement. Listening to their experiences, she felt a growing sense of solidarity. They were no longer just individuals, they were a community, ready to stand together. She started meeting a few neighbors after work or on weekends. They sat in living rooms, on porches, and in backyards, sharing notes, photos, and letters from the HOA. She encouraged them to document every interaction, every notice, and every fine. They compared experiences and realized patterns in the HOA's behavior. Some had been warned for minor issues, while others had similar violations with no consequences. She explained that knowledge and preparation would be their strongest weapons. The meetings were informal but focused, filled with laughter, frustration, and a shared determination to stand up for their rights. The coalition began to grow. Word spread slowly, and more neighbors joined. Some were shy at first, hesitant to confront the HOA. She reassured them, explaining that they did not need to be aggressive. They only needed to be organized, informed, and united. They shared tips on how to communicate respectfully with the board, how to attend meetings, and how to gather evidence. She emphasized patience and persistence, reminding everyone that this was a marathon, not a sprint. The neighborhood was beginning to feel like a team. With each member contributing their strength and voice, she also noticed that the HOA was watching more closely. Letters became slightly more cautious, warnings less aggressive. She suspected they were aware that residents were starting to organize. This gave her hope and motivation. She continued to lead by example, attending every meeting, asking questions, and documenting everything carefully. Her calm, polite, but firm approach inspired confidence in others. People started to see that the HOA's authority was not absolute, that standing together could shift the balance of power. One afternoon, she received another notice, this time about her garden. The HOA claimed that certain flowers were too colorful and disturbed the uniformity of the neighborhood. She read the letter, shook her head, and laughed quietly to herself. It was absurd, but she was no longer intimidated. Instead of panicking, she shared the letter with the coalition. They examined it, compared it to other residents' gardens, and realized it was another example of selective enforcement. Together, they drafted a respectful but firm response, asking the HOA to clarify the rules and provide consistent enforcement. This was not just about her garden, it was about fairness and accountability. The coalition began to strategize for the next HOA meeting. They planned carefully, deciding who would speak, what points to raise, and how to present evidence. They wanted to show the board that the residents were informed, organized, and united. She encouraged them to remain calm, respectful, and focused. The goal was not to create conflict, but to demand fairness and transparency. She knew that preparation and confidence would be crucial. This meeting would be more than just words, it would be a statement of collective power. When the day of the meeting arrived, the room was filled with more residents than she had ever seen. People sat quietly, but attentively, holding folders, notes, and photographs. She could feel the energy in the room, a mixture of nervousness, anticipation, and determination. The board members appeared slightly tense, clearly aware that the dynamic was changing. She walked in, held her head high, and took her seat at the front. She was ready. The meeting began with the usual formalities, but the tone quickly shifted as residents started presenting their cases. One by one, they spoke about inconsistencies, unfair fines, and confusing rules. She observed quietly, noting how each person added strength to the collective voice. When it was her turn, she presented the evidence of selective enforcement and unfair letters. Using clear examples and calm explanations, she emphasized the need for fairness, consistency, and communication. She spoke not just for herself, but for everyone who had been intimidated or ignored. The board members tried to interrupt, but she and her neighbors maintained their composure. They responded politely, stayed focused on facts, and refused to be intimidated. The room was filled with a quiet power, a sense that the residents were no longer just participants, they were advocates for their own rights. She could see the surprise and discomfort on the board members' faces. For the first time, it felt like the authority they wielded was being questioned in a meaningful way. After hours of discussion, the board agreed to review the policies and promised more transparency and enforcement. It was a small victory, but it was significant. The residents had shown that collective action could lead to change. They had not won everything, but they had taken a step toward accountability. She felt a sense of pride and relief. The coalition had proven that unity, preparation, and courage could make a difference. The streets she walked daily were beginning to reflect the voices of the people who lived there, not just the rules of a distant board. Following the meeting, the neighborhood atmosphere began to shift. More residents approached her for advice, and the coalition grew stronger. They shared experiences, helped each other navigate notices, and encouraged neighbors to document everything. The sense of fear and intimidation that once hung over the street was slowly being replaced by confidence and solidarity. People were beginning to believe that they had a voice and that it mattered. She continued her daily routines with renewed energy. She cared for her garden, organized her home, and walked the streets with pride. But now, every action was also a subtle statement of resilience. Her presence, her preparation, and her willingness to speak up had an impact. Neighbors smiled, nodded, and sometimes even thanked her quietly. She realized that leadership was not about being loud or aggressive. It was about consistency, knowledge, and a commitment to fairness. The coalition also began to share strategies for dealing with future letters and fines. They discussed approaches for polite communication, how to present evidence, and how to remain calm under pressure. She emphasized the importance of supporting one another and showing strength as a group. The neighborhood was slowly transforming from a place of fear into a place of empowerment. Each resident who spoke up, each person who documented their experiences, was contributing to a larger movement for fairness and respect. Over time, she noticed subtle changes in the HOA's behavior. Letters were more precise, warnings less aggressive, and some policies were clarified. While the board still held authority, it was clear that residents were no longer passive. They had learned to question, document, and advocate. The balance of power was beginning to shift, and she felt a deep satisfaction knowing that her efforts had contributed to this change. One evening, while walking through the neighborhood, she saw neighbors working together in their gardens, children playing safely in the streets, and a general sense of community that had been missing before. It was quiet but powerful, a visible sign of the transformation she had helped foster. She smiled, knowing that the streets were becoming more than just a place to live. They were becoming a space where people's voices mattered. She also reflected on her own growth. She had entered the neighborhood hoping for peace and quiet, but had found a challenge that tested her patience, courage, and determination. She had learned to stand up, organize, and lead. She had discovered strengths she had not known she possessed and had inspired others to find theirs. The experience had changed her. She knew it would shape her approach to life far beyond the neighborhood. The coalition continued to meet regularly, strategizing, supporting one another, and preparing for future challenges. The sense of unity and shared purpose created a strong foundation for ongoing advocacy. They were no longer just residents. They were a community ready to ensure that fairness, respect, and transparency prevailed. The streets were no longer controlled solely by the HOA. They were shaped by the people who lived there. As part 3 of her journey ended, she felt a deep sense of accomplishment. She had helped build a movement, empowered neighbors, and started to shift the balance of power. The HOA still existed and challenges remained. But she knew that courage, preparation, and solidarity could overcome even the most entrenched authority. The streets were changing, and so was she. Together with her neighbors, she was ready for whatever came next, the months of preparation and quiet. Persistence had brought the neighborhood to a turning point. The streets that had once felt tense and controlled now hummed with a subtle energy of shared purpose. She could sense it in the way neighbors smiled at her on morning walks, the way children played freely in the yards, and the quiet conversations that carried through fences. The coalition she had helped form was stronger than ever, and everyone had learned the importance of documenting every notice, letter, and fine from the HOA. It started with a new notice sent to one of the neighbors in the coalition. The HOA claimed that the color of a porch railing violated neighborhood guidelines. The neighbor was nervous, worried about fines and confrontation. She sat with them, reviewing the letter carefully. Together, they compared it to the guidelines and the situations of other residents. She encouraged calm and precise communication. They drafted a polite but firm response, highlighting inconsistencies and requesting clarification on enforcement procedures. It was a small action, but it reflected the growing strength and confidence of the community. Word spread quickly that residents were no longer silent. The HOA had once relied on fear and uncertainty to maintain control, but now that tactic was weakening. More neighbors began documenting every interaction, taking photographs, and keeping detailed notes. The coalition had created a culture of preparedness, and the streets were becoming a place where residents could assert their rights without fear. She felt proud of what they had accomplished together. The sense of community was deepening, and the streets were slowly transforming from spaces of compliance into spaces of empowerment. She knew the next HOA meeting would be critical. The board members were aware that the residents were organized, and she could sense their unease. She spent hours preparing her notes, organizing evidence, and planning her approach. She advised coalition members on how to speak, what points to emphasize, and how to remain calm even under pressure. The strategy was simple but powerful. Speak clearly, present facts, and show unity. She understood that a collective voice was stronger than any individual argument, and she was determined to use that power wisely. On the day of the meeting, the room was filled with more residents than ever before. People brought notes, photographs, and letters, each prepared to speak respectfully but firmly. She felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness. The energy in the room was palpable, a combination of anticipation, determination, and shared purpose. The board members arrived, their expressions slightly tense. They had underestimated the strength of the residents, and it was clear that the dynamic had shifted. The meeting began with the usual announcements, but the atmosphere quickly changed as residents began presenting their cases. One neighbor spoke about selective enforcement of lawn rules, another about parking fines that did not apply to others. She listened carefully, noting how each presentation added strength to the collective argument. When her turn came, she walked to the front, held her folder with evidence, and spoke clearly. She presented documented inconsistencies, explained how rules had been applied unfairly, and emphasized the need for transparency and fairness. She spoke not just for herself, but for every resident. Affected by the arbitrary actions of the HOA, the board members attempted to interrupt, but she remained calm and focused. She answered their questions politely, referring to documented evidence and highlighting specific examples of unfair enforcement. She could see the surprise and discomfort in their eyes. For the first time, their authority was being questioned in a structured and undeniable way. She continued, emphasizing that the residents were not seeking conflict, but fairness. Her calm and measured approach inspired confidence among the neighbors and drew quiet admiration even from some board members. During the meeting, she noticed a shift in the room. Some neighbors, previously quiet and hesitant, now spoke up. They added their observations, shared letters, and presented evidence. The collective voice of the residents grew stronger with every statement. The board tried to maintain control, but the cohesion and preparation of the coalition were undeniable. It was no longer just a meeting. It was a turning point in the power dynamics of the neighborhood. She felt a surge of pride and determination. The streets, once controlled by fear and rules, were becoming a space of accountability and fairness. After hours of discussion, the board agreed to review enforcement policies, clarify guidelines, and improve communication. It was a significant victory, showing that persistence, preparation, and unity could bring change. She felt a deep sense of fulfillment, knowing that the residents had not only defended their own rights, but had also set a precedent for future interactions. The coalition had proven that organized and informed action could shift power and influence the behavior of those in authority. The victory sparked further engagement in the community. More neighbors joined the coalition, and discussions about neighborhood issues became more open. Residents began to share tips, experiences, and strategies for dealing with the HOA. They encouraged each other to remain calm, respectful, and focused. The culture of fear that had once dominated the streets was slowly being replaced by a culture of empowerment. People were beginning to believe that their voices mattered and that they could influence change. She continued her daily routines with renewed energy. Gardening, walking the streets, and interacting with neighbors became acts of quiet assertion. Her presence, her preparation, and her willingness to stand up for fairness were making a visible impact. Neighbors smiled, nodded, and sometimes whispered words of thanks. She realized that leadership was not about being loud or aggressive. It was about consistency, knowledge, and a commitment to doing what was right. The coalition began to prepare for future challenges, discussing strategies for responding to notices, attending meetings, and advocating for fairness. They emphasized the importance of supporting one another and maintaining a united front. The streets, once dominated by the authority of the HOA, were now shaped by the collective action of the residents. She felt a deep satisfaction knowing that the work they were doing was creating a lasting impact on the community. One afternoon, she received a particularly aggressive notice regarding her garden. The HOA claimed that her arrangement of flowers violated aesthetic guidelines. She calmly reviewed the letter, then shared it with the coalition. Together, they drafted a response highlighting inconsistencies, citing examples of other gardens with similar arrangements that had not been penalized, and requesting clarification. It was a test of patience and diplomacy, but it also reinforced the strength and preparedness of the group. The streets were no longer spaces of arbitrary control. They were spaces of informed resistance. She also reflected on her personal growth. The experience of confronting the HOA had challenged her in ways she had never anticipated. She had learned to remain calm under pressure, to organize information, and to lead by example. She had discovered resilience, patience, and courage she had not fully recognized before. Her actions had not only influenced the behavior of the HOA, but it also inspired others to find their own strength. The streets, once intimidating, were now a canvas for empowerment and change. The coalition continued to grow and evolve. Neighbors who had been hesitant began attending meetings, sharing experiences, and supporting one another. The sense of community strengthened, and the streets became more vibrant and inclusive. People walked with confidence, knowing that their voices mattered and that they had the ability to influence decisions that affected their homes and lives. She felt a deep sense of fulfillment, knowing that the collective action she had helped initiate was transforming the neighborhood. Evenings were spent planning, strategizing, and reinforcing the bonds of the coalition. They discussed potential challenges, reviewed letters from the HOA, and prepared for upcoming meetings. The sense of unity and shared purpose created a foundation for ongoing advocacy and empowerment. The streets, once spaces of fear and compliance, were now spaces of collaboration, support, and accountability. As part 4 of her journey came to a close, she felt a profound sense of accomplishment. She had helped build a movement, empower neighbors, and challenge authority in a way that was respectful, informed, and effective. The HOA still existed, and challenges remained. But she knew that courage, preparation, and solidarity could overcome even the most entrenched power structures. The streets were changing, and so was she. Together with her neighbors, she was ready to face whatever came next. Knowing that their collective voice could shape the community for the better, the neighborhood had transformed completely from the quiet, tense streets she first moved into. The HOA still existed, but its power had diminished. Residents walked with confidence, engaged with one another, and no longer feared arbitrary fines or letters. The coalition she had helped build had become a guiding force, teaching neighbors that knowledge, unity, and persistence could bring change. She could see the difference in everyday life. People laughed freely in their yards. Children played openly in the streets, and neighbors greeted each other with genuine warmth. The sense of community was palpable. It began with a new initiative from the coalition. They decided to create a clear system for residents to handle any future conflicts with the HOA. They drafted guidelines on documenting notices, gathering evidence, and communicating effectively. They encouraged everyone to keep records of their interactions, take photographs, and remain calm when responding to letters. The goal was to make the residents self-reliant and resilient, able to address challenges without fear or hesitation. This initiative strengthened the neighborhood and gave everyone a sense of control over their own lives. She led by example. Every time she received a letter or notice, she calmly read it, documented it, and shared the information with the coalition. She encouraged neighbors to attend meetings, speak respectfully, and use facts to support their points. She reminded them that their voices mattered and that they were part of a larger movement for fairness. The streets were no longer dominated by fear. They were spaces of empowerment, and she was at the center of the transformation. One day, a particularly difficult situation arose. The HOA sent a notice claiming that several homes in the neighborhood were in violation of landscaping rules, including some coalition members. The letter was intimidating, threatening significant fines. Instead of panic, the residents turned to the coalition. She organized an immediate strategy meeting. They reviewed the letters carefully, compared them to the rules, and gathered photographs and documentation from all affected homes. They discussed how to approach the HOA calmly and collectively. The residents felt nervous, but with her guidance, they were ready. The coalition drafted a collective response, highlighting inconsistencies and requesting clarification on enforcement procedures. They requested that the HOA provide consistent guidelines and fair treatment for all residents. The letter was polite but firm, showing unity and preparedness. She emphasized that the strength of the group lay in calm, factual communication and collective action. When the response was submitted, she felt a sense of pride in how far the neighborhood had come. The streets were no longer a place of intimidation. They were a space where residents could assert their rights confidently.